I like Disturbed. They're a great band for the most part, and they make some great music. They're not my favorites, but they're definitely somewhere in my top 10, maybe even top 5. My favorite album, though, has to be Immortalized. It's the most consistently high quality album they have, and I recommend to everyone to at least give it a shot. From the Vengeful One to Your Mind to Save Our Last Goodbyes. Hell, it even has a remastered version of Sound of Silence, which is probably their most popular song. The final song in the album is called Who Taught You How to Hate? If you don't include the extra tracks. The song is about inherited hatred, taught hatred, for kids. Holding a belief that isn't yours but your peers, not thinking, simply borrowing the experiences of someone else. But what can you do? You're a child. You are impressionable. Children are easily manipulated and controlled by the people they look up to. That can be a parent, an idol, or simply someone older. The song is about the loss of innocence and grooming kids with dangerous ideals, which is also a big part of Fishman Island from One Piece. Finally got there. For those that don't know and don't engage with One Piece, Fishman Island is a really controversial arc that immediately follows the big time skip in One Piece. After rereading it for the second time, I can definitely understand why. While I will cover the themes of the arc, first I want to go over my own experience with Fishman Island as someone who first watched, yes, watched, the arc and then later read it in the manga, and finally read it again for this video. Honestly, you could just go listen to Who Taught You How to Hate and review the arc yourself, but you're not going to do that, which is why I'm here. So, let's just start. When I first started One Piece, I was one very bored kid that hadn't yet consumed a lot of media, which is why I didn't have a problem with the pacing of the anime. Even so, I didn't really like Fishman Island. It was just not that memorable. It was in almost every sense of the sound. It felt like it went on for too long and never reached the peaks that previous arcs had. Years later, I decided to read the One Piece manga for the first time, which of course is much better than the anime. Fishman Island was one of the arcs that I grew to like a lot more in my reread. It just felt more. Nothing special, but pretty fun in its own way. Which leads us to a few weeks ago when I decided to solely read Fishman Island in preparation for this video. And I loved it. It was actually really fun. Even more so than I was expecting, and I think I know why. Expectation. For one, for the longest time, I would argue ever since Arlong Park, we knew that we were going to get a Fishman Island arc in some way, shape or form. There's this whole unique race in this story that comes from an island. I wonder how they can be explored in their own habitat, and so on. It took us over hundreds of chapters to get there, but we got there in the end. Almost. The story made it pretty clear that Fishman Island is going to happen, especially in Hody. It was almost getting hyped up as a climax, as the final island of the Grand Line which we have been stuck in for hundreds of chapters. Except that isn't what Fishman Island turned out to be. Hody felt like it was going to be a small arc setting up Fishman Island. But in actuality, it is an arc that leads to a completely different storyline revolving around the Navy and the world government. Hody is a great and memorable arc because of how much it shatters expectations. Following it is Amazon Lily, which is a short but sweet arc leading into Impel Down and Marineford. No one was expecting much of Amazon Lily, which is why it's remembered fondly. The opposite is true for Impel Down and Marineford. Both arcs had high expectations and both delivered spectacularly. Both are still regarded as the best arcs of One Piece, and also my personal favorites. Post-war arc is, well, the conclusion of that whole saga. I love it, most people love it, and it paves the way for the time skip. After that, we get the Return to Sabaody arc, which is incredibly short and incredibly fun. A setup for a new dawn into literally the new world. And the first big arc of the post-time skip is Fishman Island. An arc that is mostly there to hype up the Straw Hats and doesn't actually feel all that tense. An arc that felt like it was going to be the closing chapter of the Grand Line, but in reality is the opening chapter of the new world. An arc that followed the greatest arcs of One Piece in Impel Down and Marineford, but didn't reach anywhere near the same heights as them, which made it incredibly disappointing when I first watched it. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Sabaody could have perfectly led to Fishman Island, but it did something entirely different to the benefit of itself, its subsequent arcs, and One Piece as a whole. But as a consequence, the stakes of Fishman Island felt much lower than I had anticipated. Especially when watching the anime, where the pacing of the story gets much worse in post-time skip. Hody, the main villain of the arc, was a complete chump. His gang members were chumps. His character felt stupid. Shirahoshi was annoying, and Sanji spent half the arc dying because of a gag. Of course, this was all my opinion when I first experienced it, and I'm guessing that other people felt similarly. In contrast, when you experience something again, expectations don't really affect your view of whatever you're experiencing. When I read the arc for the first time, I knew what I was going into. I knew what to expect, so it was much more enjoyable. I didn't think of it as the end of the Grand Line, but as the start to the new world. A beginning, not an end. That made the arc much better. Even so, it was just a decent arc, nothing truly special. Over time, I slowly grew to appreciate the main story of it as well, which led me to make this video and read the entirety of the arc again by itself. And it was better than expected, probably because of the fact that it's one of the least liked arcs in the series. Because of that, I liked it more. I know that my experience isn't going to be universal, and there are people that won't relate to this segment, but even so, I feel like it's hard to talk about the arc without bringing up how badly expectations affected my experience of it when I first watched it. I will talk more about this later, but for now, let's talk about the arc itself, because unlike what past you might think, this arc is actually really well thought out and deep. I know, I'm a very funny guy. The arc starts with the descent into Fishman Island, and it does what One Piece does best: world building. Getting the deep sea fleshed out is fun and interesting. One thing to note is that the arc is much funnier than I remember it. Over the course of the video, I will show some of my favorite panels, so enjoy those. Other than that, with what we know now about characters like Kuma, and later on the way it revisits past villains like Arlong, makes it an arc that does a lot not just for itself, but other arcs as well. The Reverie is also a big focus, which later becomes one of the best short arcs in the story. Now, there is one thing about Oda that I learned during this read-through. One of the worst parts of the arc for a lot of people is how Sanji almost dies from nosebleeding near the start of the arc because he's a pervert. It's a gag, something that is only meant to be funny, if it's even that, affecting the story itself. Of course, there is undeniably a good point to it as well, telling the audience that fishmen cannot donate blood to humans because of a law which leads nicely to the end of the arc. Still, it makes Sanji annoying, and it isn't that funny to most people. I liked it, I didn't mind a lot of the annoying stuff, but as I said, this helped me understand something about Oda as a writer. Oda doesn't do gags. What I mean by that is that to him, stuff like Sanji being a perverted simp, Zoro getting lost all the time, and Nami being a gold digger are not gags, they are character traits. Zoro is as much of a swordsman as he's bad at navigation, and it's not meant to just be a gag, but a character trait as a whole. Same goes with Sanji. Because he was not in the proximity of the female sex for 2 years, he had to get therapy to get used to them again. Because just seeing one would make him simp too much. So that's what happens. Luffy always screams out that he's going to the Pirate King. Zoro always gets lost, and Sanji always gets hard. Whether that's a good thing or not depends entirely to you. I understand it, I'm fine with it, sometimes I like it. But it's very much so a personal preference. Besides that, we have Caribou, which is funny but doesn't really do anything this arc. We get introduced to the new Fishman pirates and Vanderdecken, which are the two main antagonistic forces of the arc that I will get to later. Charlie's prediction happens here, but I'm not going to talk about it because that still hasn't been resolved yet. Might be a final war thing. The Fishman Royals are fine, nothing much to say about them. The only other relevant side characters in the arc that I can think of, excluding Flashbacks, are Jinbei, which everyone loves, I don't need to talk about him much, and Shirahoshi. Whiny, scaredy doo-doo characters are much less unpleasant when they don't have a voice, and other characters bully them, which is why I actually enjoyed her presence here. The arc is, for the most part, comedic, with some really heavy themes thrown into its flashbacks and ending parts. Because it's right after the time skip, none of the Straw Hats have any problems with the enemies in the arc. Even when the Straw Hats were in some kind of danger at certain points, it didn't feel hopeless at all. It's like the Straw Hats were simply too overleveled for the arc, and kind of just demolished all of their oppositions. It's meant to show us the growth that the crew has had as a whole after 2 years of training, but while that is a good thing, it's also the main reason why the arc feels so low stakes. It's not a bad thing, but as I said, it clashes with the initial expectations one might have with the arc before the end of Sabaody. I feel like that is all the small stuff that I really needed to bring up. Otherwise, I'm gonna talk about the 2 flashbacks of the arc. I won't go too deep, but I need to talk about them for the sake of the main antagonist of the arc, Hody Jones. So, let's go over those before anything else. Near the middle of the arc, some of the Straw Hats and some of the other side characters reach Jinbei in the outskirts of the island. For one, he wants to thank the Straw Hats for taking down Arlong all the way back in the East Blue, and to say sorry for freeing Arlong in the first place. And one of the Straw Hats present in this conversation is Nami. Witch hunt me if you want, I was never the biggest fan of Arlong Park, nor Arlong. While that arc is when most people fall in love with One Piece, for me it was always just a decent arc. But with the context that Fishman Island provides, that arc seems more interesting to me. It's just more. Nami quickly accepting Jinbei's apology, I think, is a really good character moment for her. She has moved on for the most part and mostly just cares about her current family now. Her old family that Arlong took away from her, not winding her down. Before she accepts his apology though, we get the 2 stories that Jinbei talks about. The flashbacks of Otohime and Fisher Tiger. Let's talk about Fisher Tiger first. To me, his flashback is just a shorter, better, more compact Oden backstory. I feel like he succeeded in all the ways that Oden failed. His backstory just feels more natural to the world of One Piece. Maybe if I reread Wano, I would feel different towards Odin, but I'm not gonna do that for this video. So, Fisher Tiger. His story is simple. He was a great fishman that, in the end, never managed to let go of his bias. He grew up outside of Fishman Island, in the Fishman district where Arlong, Hody, and the like grew up, and he had a heart of gold, an inspiration to every broken and abused fishman out there. Every kid in Fishman district looked up to him, and the older guys all loved him. He went out, adventured, and brought back stories. One time though, he messed up and became a slave to the celestial dragons for a couple years. That made him hate humanity. Even so, when he broke his chains, he broke the chains of every other slave as well, human and fishman, allowing everyone a chance at escape. Once he returned to his home island, he gathered a bunch of people in the Fishman district and started the Sun Pirates. They only had one rule: don't kill, not even humans. That rule wasn't made out of morality, but out of fear. Not of the humans, but of himself. He was old, around 50 during the flashback. He had grown up disliking humans because that was just the thing to do as a fishman child. After his enslavement, his hatred grew to unbelievable heights. It was a Batman situation. If he killed a human once, he would go on a rampage and kill as many as possible. He wouldn't stop, even if he faced the innocents. In the end, it was a mixture of that fear, his old beliefs, and racism that killed him. After he got ambushed and subsequently saved by his comrades, he was bleeding to death. If he didn't have that no killing rule, he wouldn't have ended up this way. If it wasn't for his racism, he could have been saved. But they only had human blood on their ship, so he died of blood loss. He wanted a world where humans and fishmen could live together, a world where his brethren could live in the embrace of the sun. But the problem was that he didn't want to live in a world like that himself. It was an ideal future for his race, a future that he could not live in. And so, because of his contradictory nature, he died. There were two fishmen in his crew that were stronger and more charismatic than the others, Jinbei and Arlong. They both also grew up in the Fishman district and both held racist views towards humans. Arlong more radical, Jinbei more laid back. Both racists. After Fisher Tiger's death, and after everything that the Sun Pirates went through, both of these characters got ambitions. Jinbei wanted to honor Fisher Tiger, so he threw away his hatred to work towards a world where fishmen could live on the surface. He became a warlord, befriended Whitebeard, and overall tried to do as much good as he could. Arlong, on the other hand, was filled with hatred. He was always hot-blooded, and after Fisher Tiger's death, he turned into the biggest villain he could possibly be. He wreaked havoc in the East Blue, and basically enslaved as many humans as he could. Hody, which was directly above Fishman Island, was a place he had seen many times, but never entered. There was a bright theme park that really inspired him, called Hody Park. A park that he never went to, a symbol of what he couldn't have. So, in the East Blue, he turned his main base of operations into the Arlong Park to imitate that. If he couldn't enter that park, he would make one himself. Radical, cruel, and prideful, the opposite path of Jinbei. But that's enough of Fisher Tiger. Let's talk a little bit about the Otohime flashback as well. Otohime was the queen of Fishman Island. Unlike Fisher Tiger, she held zero malice against humans. She had no demons. While Fisher Tiger wanted to put pride into the Fishman name forcefully, she wanted to do it diplomatically. So she tried to strike a deal with the world government. She needed the signatures of her citizens and was doing pretty well for a while. That is, until Fisher Tiger started his odyssey which put a pause into Otomi's plans for a few years. Didn't get better after Fisher Tiger died either. Every Fishman blamed the humans for his death, so they didn't want their home to be a part of the world government, something made by humans. One day, a celestial dragon crashed into Fishman Island and almost died. Being the good little celestial dragon that he was, he ordered the fishmen around him to heal him, calling them his slaves, as he was dying. Otohime stopped her people from killing him right then and there and treated him respectfully even as he was being difficult. As a celestial dragon, he could help Otohime get her kingdom into the reverie and the world government. Once it was time for him to go back, she accompanied him even though she was weak and could be enslaved after getting there. That didn't happen and she returned to Fishman Island safely. Through goodwill alone, she managed to change the celestial dragon, an icon of xenophobia, into something better. After relentlessly spreading hope among her subjects, eventually they start to sign the signatures needed to get their kingdom into the reverie. But not everything went as planned. As things were going well, she got assassinated in broad daylight, and the only suspect was a human pirate. In reality, Hody Jones was the one who had killed her, but he framed a human for reasons I will talk about in the next segment. She died quickly after, taking away whatever hope she had given to the Fishman, which concludes both flashbacks. Everything I just went through is important to Hody Jones and his ideals. The most important part of this video is the next segment, and I'm going to tell you why possibly the most pathetic antagonist in One Piece is actually great. I know what I said, but this arc has two villains, one much more interesting than the other. I like Vanderdecken and his grind set. He's a funny guy. At the end of the day, for the most part, he is just a pedophile. The Flying Dutchman could have been much more interesting, and Vanderdecken looks cool, but at the end of the day, he is just a pedophile. I do not need to talk about him. Instead, I will focus solely on Hody Jones and his gang. Hody and his friends also grew up in the Fishman district. During the escapades of the Sun Pirates, they were all pretty young. They all loved Fisher Tiger like pretty much every other Fishman. Hody specifically really looked up to Arlong. Before joining the Sun Pirates, Arlong had his own crew and his own stories. Him and other grown-up fishmen. Arlong was arrogantly racist to the point that he consistently demonized humans in all of his stories. Hody loved those stories. He loved hearing about how great fishmen are, how much stronger they are, how much smarter they are, how holier they are, how they took down the humans, how they beat their enemies, beat those pitiful humans, those disgusting apes, those wretched service-dueling demons. He loved hearing about how his idol crushed the stains of the world, how his brethren ripped the fully skinny devils to pieces, or how they drowned them, or how they humiliated them. To Hody, a kid who had no parents, no guardians, and lived in a secluded part of Fishman Island, these stories were comforting. Those stories gave him someone to blame, a reason to grow. Whenever another fishman spoke good of humans, like Hachi, he simply walked away. To him, those fishmen were sympathizing with murderers and slavers. As a kid, Hody never even saw a human. Even so, he was taught to hate them. Arlong, while cruel, had a reason why he was such a villain in Arlong Park. He had experienced tragedy due to humans. He lost his captain. He went to prison and went through pain because of humans. He was a villain, but he was understandable. His hatred was natural, it was realistic. The same could not be said about Hody. Because he was taught to hate at such a young age, His hatred was unrealistic. Arlong's bigotry was mostly due to his pain. He too disliked humans from a young age, but not to the same extent. He didn't have the same ambitions. Hody's bigotry was the result of his education. You need water to survive. Lights make things bright. Humans are devils. That's what he was told, and that's what got ingrained into him. His friends were no different. He was just the most charismatic one. This is something that happens in real life. Kids get taught to hate other countries in their schools. You get rewarded for your xenophobia. Sometimes they make you yell about how much you hate other countries. This is all true, and I can tell you from personal experience. Trust me, no one is immune to propaganda, especially you and me. Getting back to Hody, he eventually joined the army and assassinated Otohime. To him, she was going to bring ruin to the Fishman society. She wanted to work with demons, so she had to die. She too had to be a demon. He framed a human because humans are devils anyway. The people simply need to understand. I mean, a human was probably going to kill Otohime anyway. He stole the lifespan-reducing energy steroids from Fishman Island and returned to the Fishman district to build an army. He grew up, and so did his views. He grew wiser. Arlong was a great man. He was Hody's idol. Even so, he had to admit, Arlong had flaws. He wasn't radical enough. He was too prideful and disjointed. He thought that he was better than others, so he didn't ally with Vanderdecken. He wanted to only have people with his own ideals in his crew. He didn't realize that some people just wanted other things, like money, like Hyozo. Worst of all, Arlong never realized that there were a lot of demons around him as well. Those human, sympathizing fishmen. They needed to die as well, for a united Fishman paradise. Those are the reasons why Arlong failed. Hody didn't want to make the same mistakes. Whenever a fishman donated blood to a human, he executed the fishman. Whenever humans showed their face to him, he enslaved them. This lifestyle of his leads us to the Fishman Island arc, where he managed to usurp the Ryugu Fishman Island Kingdom throne due to the Straw Hats. After Otohime's death, the princes of the kingdom managed to get a lot of signatures through time, all of which fell into the hands of Hody. Hody was planning to execute every fishman that had written signatures. Those signatures were proof of corruption within Fishman Island. To kill them was only natural. It was the heroic thing to do. He wanted to kill the king and the princes in front of everyone, but fails because of the Straw Hats. I'm not going to talk about the fights because they aren't important. Near the end, when Fukaboshi asks Hody what did the humans even do to him, Hody tells him nothing. A lot of people hate this and think that this is stupid, but it's an incredible answer from a storytelling standpoint, from a character standpoint. Unlike Arlong, Jinbei, Fisher Tiger, and the older generations, he himself was pretty much unharmed by humans, at least not directly. Because he never saw any humans in his childhood, his xenophobia turned fantastical. Arlong, despite his views, still saw humans as a race of people. He saw them as less than fishmen, but a race of people nonetheless. Hody, on the other hand, saw humans as mystical creatures born of evil, a race meant to either worship him and his people, or to be exterminated. After he is beaten by Luffy, him and his crew get imprisoned. In their cells, they all suddenly turn into super old people because of how much they abuse their energy steroids. They turned as old as their beliefs. Senile old men, barely clinging to life, hanging on to their old beliefs while refusing to change in any way, shape, or form. Trapped in their own delusions, forced to rot away their last remaining years without seeing the sun again. Hody is a pathetic villain, from his quote-unquote power to his beliefs to even his peak strength. But that's not a point against him from a writing standpoint. Him being pathetic is what makes him a good villain. Him being so scarily, cartoonishly, and realistically evil is what makes him so memorable. At least, to me. The biggest mistake of the Ryugu Kingdom was the Fishman district. Banishing all your criminals right outside your city is certainly a decision. Because they never bothered to check up on the district, Hody easily built an army and managed to invade Fishman Island. In short, Neptune and his sons are stupid. I don't think I need to talk about why the end part with Jinbei donating his blood to Luffy is so good and fits so well thematically, so I won't. Of course, there are some parts of this arc that are just bad or weird as well. The standout one is Shirahoshi being aware of who murdered Otohime but not telling anyone because Otohime told everyone to not hold hatred against whoever killed her. Jinbei tries to spin this as a courageous and respectable move on Shirahoshi's part, but I'm sorry Jinbei, are you stupid? Are you mentally challenged? Are you serious? Because of the fact that Shirahoshi didn't just speak up, a lot of people probably died and suffered. Hody killed, enslaved, and tyrannically ruled the Fishman district for years. If Shirahoshi just spoke up, the Fishman Island arc wouldn't happen in the first place. She wasn't being mama's good girl, she was being a dumb, stupid idiot. She didn't have to rat Hody out of hatred, she could have just done it out of duty because, you know, she's a princess. Anyway, before I start going on a rant about that, I want to play around with the whole expectation problem I mentioned near the start of the video. You know, a fun exercise. Imagine if after Whole Cake, before Wano, the Straw Hats stopped at a fun, small island to prepare for Wano. A short arc, if you will. But, before the gang gets to Wano, something big happens, and instead of moving to Wano, we get some of the best arcs of One Piece back to back. Some of the best political world building in the series. And finally, a second 2-year time skip. After 2 years, the gang gets back together and demolishes Wano. Instead of having Wano be a climax, made it the start to the post time skip. That is basically what happened with Fishman Island, at least to me. Of course, this comparison isn't nearly of the same scale, but it still paints an interesting picture. It's not a great comparison, but I think it works to an extent. I think I've talked about everything, so let's just move to the outro. This video was surprisingly about the length that I was expecting. A bit longer, but not by much. I hope that I managed to make you appreciate Fishman Island more, but even if I didn't, I made you watch till the end of this video, which is still good for me. The biggest problem with One Piece is its sense of time. If Oda had made the journey take more years, One Piece would be so much better. As it is now, Luffy managed to turn into an emperor in just 3 to 4 years, which is stupid. People don't talk about this enough, it's so annoying. Just make post-time skip Luffy 30 or something, I don't know. Anyway, like, subscribe, dislike, comment, give me suggestions, all that YouTube stuff. If you don't give me ideas, I might have to visit LB6 again.